Tonight, we drift into early March 2020 when a virus turned bustling streets silent and four friends, Chamath, Jason, David Sachs, and David Friedberg, found themselves dialing into a video call from their own kitchen tables. Their weekly poker game was gone. They saw each other's faces on screen and opened laptops to talk through what the pandemic might do to markets, to the startups they supported. Without planning to, one of them pressed record. That simple gesture became the first episode of the All In podcast, uploaded on March 19, 2020, in the earliest days of lockdown. They joked in the notes about when their poker game might resume, even as the stock market sank and headlines grew darker. What they created that night was not a show in any formal sense, but a way to steady themselves through conversation. As you settle beneath the covers, imagine their voices on that call. Chamath Palihapitiya, born in Sri Lanka and raised in Canada after his family sought asylum, leaned toward the camera with the quiet intensity of someone who has lived through uncertainty before. Jason Calacanis, the relentless Brooklyn hustler, shifted between alarm and gallows humor as he narrated the news ticker. David Sachs, the PayPal veteran whose mind moves along legal and constitutional rails, spoke carefully about government overreach and emergency powers. David Friedberg, trained in physics and shaped by years in climate technology, explained viral curves and the fragile logistics of vaccine distribution. These four perspectives, so different in temperament and training, intertwined in a single digital space. Between their voices, you might sense the hush of those early lockdown days. Distant sirens, the creak of a house settling under unfamiliar stillness, the small domestic sounds of family life in the background. The men paused often, absorbing the weight of what was unfolding, speaking again only when a new insight surfaced. In their hesitation there was a kind of shared exhale. They did not intend to guide anyone or influence policy. They were simply trying to understand the unknown. Yet, as the episode reached listeners around the world, thousands recognized something calming in the mix of candor, data, and weary humor. And so a new ritual began, born out of isolation but carried forward by connection, as the world outside continued to slow into quiet. Before All In had a name or an audience, the conversations that shaped it were already well practiced. Around poker tables and dinner gatherings, the four friends learned how to challenge each other without breaking the gentle rhythm of trust. Each carried a different lens onto the world, one tuned to markets, one to policy, one to operating realities, and one to scientific foundations. These differences were not obstacles, but anchors that kept their discussions from drifting into echo chambers, giving their exchanges an unusual breadth and balance. Chamath brought the long-range view of someone shaped by scarcity and systems thinking. His habit was to zoom out, connecting small events to larger patterns and asking what kind of society emerges on the other side of crisis. Jason brought the operator's instincts, honed from years of building companies and mentoring founders. He was quick to find the practical angle, the part of a problem that could be solved with grit or iteration. David Sachs entered each conversation with a disciplined legal and structural mindset, questioning incentives, precedents, and potential unintended consequences. David Friedberg, in contrast, moved easily through data, biology, climate, and statistics, offering grounding when the others drifted into speculation. Their talks were lively but rarely sharp. They shared a mutual understanding that disagreement, delivered with care, was a form of respect. When debates heated, they often paused, smiled, and allowed the moment to cool before continuing. Over time, they developed a subtle conversational choreography. One would pose a question, another would counter, a third would reframe the issue, and the fourth would connect it back to a broader context. Many who later listened to the podcast would assume this pattern was scripted. In truth, it emerged from the quiet familiarity built over years of listening closely to one another. This balance became the foundation on which All In would grow. The hosts could speak freely precisely because each trusted the others to hold the conversation steady. And as the pandemic deepened and their private calls evolved into public episodes, that balance of fact and narrative, precision and softness, would become the signature cadence of the show, drawing listeners toward their calm even as the world felt increasingly uncertain. To understand how these four voices found harmony, we drift backward through time, across oceans and decades, to the separate beginnings that shaped them. Before there were microphones, there were childhoods marked by upheaval, ambition, and quiet endurance. In Sri Lanka, a young boy named Chamath learned early that instability could shape a family's fate, and that migration might one day be the only way forward. In Brooklyn, Jason navigated crowded apartments and long subway rides, carrying newspapers and dreaming of something larger than the neighborhood streets. In South Africa, two boys, David Sachs in Cape Town and David Friedberg in Johannesburg, grew up watching their parents work hard to build stability in uncertain times. Though they lived continents apart, their early years carried faint echoes of one another. Parents who sacrificed for opportunity, schools that offered both refuge and challenge, and a sense that mastering knowledge might be a way to steer one's own future. Each learned resilience in a different form. Chamath moved with his family to Canada, adapting to new languages and expectations. Jason pushed his way into college through sheer persistence and part-time work. Sachs excelled academically, using debate and philosophy to make sense of unfamiliar surroundings. Friedberg immersed himself in science, finding order in the laws that govern the natural world. These beginnings planted the seeds of their later perspectives. A background in hardship can lead to a hunger for clarity, and all four developed habits of questioning the world around them. They observed, calculated, experimented, and though they could not have imagined it then, These habits would eventually guide their conversations through economic shocks, political shifts, and technological revolutions. Their early lives did not point toward a shared destiny. Instead, they shaped four distinct paths that, much later, would intersect at a poker table and then again before a recording screen. As we float through these memories, the details soften into atmosphere, the hum of old televisions, the smell of street food, the glow of library lamps during late-night study sessions. What remains sharp is the feeling of motion, each boy moving slowly but steadily toward a future built by his own hands. It is from these distant origins that the cadence of All In would one day draw its steady, grounded voice. Chamath's journey begins in Sri Lanka, where political tension and uncertainty shaped the early contours of his childhood. When he was still young, his father's diplomatic posting brought the family to Ottawa, and when the assignment ended, they applied for asylum rather than return to instability. Life in Canada was often difficult. The family lived in public housing, navigating long stretches of unemployment, and at 14, Chamath took a job at a fast food counter to help cover bills. These experiences carved into him a deep awareness of inequality and a belief that systems, when designed well, could lift people rather than hold them down. School offered a sense of direction. Chamath excelled in mathematics and engineering, eventually earning admission to the University of Waterloo, where co-op programs allowed him to alternate study with paid technical work. Each placement strengthened his skill at building products and understanding how technology solved real problems. After graduation, he worked briefly in investment banking before joining AOL and later Facebook, where he helped steer the company's user growth engine during its rapid expansion. His work immersed him in the mechanics of networks, incentives, and global systems that scale. In 2011, he founded Social Capital, a venture firm focused on health, education, and financial inclusion. He invested in companies like Yammer and Slack and backed startups that aimed to reshape essential societal infrastructure. His philosophy combined analytical rigor with a belief that markets, when aligned with human needs, could drive meaningful change. But beneath the spreadsheets and forecasts remained the memory of his own family's struggle, the feeling of stepping into a new country with almost nothing. When he later joined the All-In conversations, this background gave his voice a distinct texture, contemplative, sometimes contrarian, willing to zoom out until the world fit into broader arcs. As you listen to his contributions, you may sense the echo of that young boy in Ottawa, absorbing lessons about scarcity, opportunity, and the quiet endurance required to build a life from uncertainty. Imagine a narrow street in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, in the 1970s. The smell of fresh bread drifting from corner bakeries, children weaving between parked cars, and a young boy named Jason Calacanis, learning to navigate a neighborhood alive with energy. His parents, of Greek and Irish heritage, worked long hours, and Jason picked up odd jobs to help out, delivering newspapers and sweeping storefronts. These early hustles were less about ambition and more about necessity, but they planted in him a belief that persistence could move mountains. In high school, he developed a passion for writing and media, dreaming of telling the stories unfolding around him. Fordham University became his next target, but admission was not guaranteed. Jason called the school repeatedly, persuading administrators to give him a chance. And once enrolled, he worked multiple jobs to pay his way. He absorbed lessons from professors, but his most important education came from observing the early stirrings of the Internet, this new frontier that promised to upend traditional gatekeeping. After college, he founded Silicon Alley Reporter, a small newsletter covering New York's emerging tech scene. He wrote, edited, and distributed it himself, watching it grow from a hand-stapled pamphlet into a widely read magazine. In 2003, he co-founded Weblogs, Inc., a network of blogs that captured the rapidly expanding online world. When AOL acquired the company 2 years later, Jason became a prominent figure in digital media, eventually turning to angel investing and launching platforms that connected founders with capital and mentorship. His voice on All In carries the rhythm of those early Brooklyn streets, quick, candid, direct. He moderates conversations with a blend of skepticism and excitement, always searching for the practical angle, the part of a problem that can be solved with grit. And beneath the bravado lies the same instinct that carried him through his youth, a belief that anyone with enough tenacity and curiosity can shape the world they live in. David Sacks's story begins far from the venture capital boardrooms, where he would later become known. He was born in Cape Town in 1972, into a country defined by rigid systems and long-standing divisions. When he was still a child, his family left South Africa and settled in Tennessee, exchanging one structured society for another, quieter one. The move required adjustment, and young David learned early how rules, institutions, and incentives shape everyday life. In school, he gravitated toward books rather than spectacle. History, economics, and philosophy offered him a sense of order. He became fascinated by how systems endure, how laws are written, and how unintended consequences emerge when incentives are poorly designed. Debate became a way of thinking rather than competing, a calm testing of ideas rather than an emotional exchange. That discipline carried him to Stanford University, where he studied economics, and later to the University of Chicago Law School, an institution famous for its rigorous, logic-driven view of markets and regulation. By the time he entered the technology world, Sacks had already developed a framework-first mindset. He did not ask whether something was exciting, but whether it was durable. When he joined PayPal as one of its earliest executives, those instincts shaped his role. He focused on compliance, operations, and product structure, helping transform a fragile startup into a functioning financial institution. Years later, that same grounding would become central to his presence on All In, where his voice often slows the conversation, anchoring bold claims in legal reality and institutional memory. David Friedberg's early years unfolded along a different rhythm. Born in South Africa, he moved to Los Angeles at the age of 6 as his parents pursued careers in filmmaking. The city promised opportunity, but it also demanded resilience. Film work was unpredictable, and the family learned to live with uncertainty, adapting when projects ended and income shifted. As a child, Friedberg sought stability in patterns. Science offered consistency where life did not. Numbers behaved predictably. Physical laws did not change with circumstance. This quiet fascination deepened into study, eventually leading him to the University of California, Berkeley, where he pursued astrophysics. He was drawn to systems that operated on time scales larger than human anxiety. Alongside science, Friedberg learned poker, not as entertainment, but as probability. He learned to assess incomplete information, to remain calm under pressure, and to accept variance without panic. These lessons followed him long after the cards were put away. After Berkeley, he joined Google during its early growth years, working in data-driven environments that valued experimentation and scale. Later, he founded Weather Bill, which evolved into the Climate Corporation, applying predictive modeling to agricultural risk. On All In, Friedberg's voice reflects this background, measured, data-anchored, and quietly reassuring, often bringing scientific grounding to otherwise abstract debates. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, all four men had found their way into the expanding world of technology, though through very different doors. Chamath arrived through engineering and growth, Jason through media and storytelling, Sachs through payments and operations, and Friedberg through data and science. None followed a straight path, and none moved quickly without learning from friction. Early roles at AOL, PayPal, Google, and small startups functioned as apprenticeships. They learned how products fail, how teams fracture under pressure, and how incentives shape behavior. They watched bubbles inflate and collapse. They experienced the tension between optimism and discipline that defines emerging markets. These years built a shared vocabulary. They learned to talk about cash flow the way others talk about weather. They understood that markets are emotional, not rational, and that human behavior often matters more than models. Over time, these insights settled into instinct. When they later gathered around poker tables, conversation flowed easily from personal stories into market analysis. They did not posture. They compared notes. The foundation for All In was already present. Long before microphones or audiences entered the picture, what would later feel effortless had been quietly rehearsed for years. Each man eventually crossed the same threshold, the leap from employee to founder. It is a moment that demands conviction and tolerance for uncertainty. David Sachs founded Yammer, building an enterprise network that spread organically within companies, eventually leading to its acquisition by Microsoft. David Friedberg's Climate Corporation blended science and economics to manage weather risk for agriculture. Chamath founded Social Capital, investing with a thesis that technology should address structural problems in society. Jason built and sold Weblogs Inc., then turned toward angel investing and founder mentorship, focusing on early-stage guidance rather than late-stage polish. These experiences changed them. Payroll became personal. Decisions carried weight. Success was no longer abstract. They learned what it meant to sit with risk, to manage failure quietly, and to accept responsibility for outcomes beyond their control. On All In, this shared founder history softens even their sharpest critiques. They understand what it costs to build something real, and that understanding creates empathy beneath the debate. By the early 2010s, their paths began intersecting with greater frequency. Silicon Valley, vast as it appears, often feels intimate. Investment rounds overlap. Conferences repeat familiar faces. Chamath invested in Yammer and later in the Climate Corporation, linking his trajectory with both Sachs and Friedberg. Jason crossed paths with each through media, investing, and mutual introductions. These intersections were unremarkable at the time. Shared meals, board conversations, long evenings discussing ideas without urgency. Trust accumulated slowly, through repetition rather than declarations. Eventually, poker became the constant, a weekly ritual where hierarchy dissolved and conversation flowed freely. Wins and losses mattered less than the rhythm of thinking together. It was here that All In truly formed, not as a show, but as a habit of shared reasoning. When the world later shut down in 2020, that habit simply moved online. And when one conversation was recorded, it carried with it years of shared context, patience, and trust, enough to carry millions of listeners gently toward sleep. Poker had always been the quiet center of their friendship, not for spectacle and not for the money, but for the rhythm it imposed on weeks otherwise filled with motion. Once a week, they gathered around a table, cards shuffling softly, chairs pulled close, glasses resting nearby. The room would settle as the game began. Poker slowed time. It demanded patience. Decisions were made with incomplete information, and outcomes were accepted without explanation or regret. For people whose days were governed by markets, deadlines, and constant noise, the game offered something rare. It created neutral ground. Titles dissolved almost immediately. A venture capitalist could lose a hand to an operator. A founder could bluff an investor. Between hands, conversation drifted naturally, unforced and unplanned. One moment, it touched on a company struggling to raise capital. Another moment, it turned toward regulation, geopolitics, or the quiet anxieties of parenting that rarely surfaced elsewhere. The stakes were intentionally modest, enough to keep attention sharp, but never enough to strain relationships or egos. Food arrived in takeout containers and was shared without ceremony. Bottles rested open on the counter, untouched for long stretches. Laptops sat closed nearby, visible reminders of work deliberately left outside the room. The point was not competition. The point was presence, and the shared agreement that this time belonged to no one else. Over time, the poker table became a laboratory for ideas. Someone would float a theory about interest rates or technology adoption or market cycles, and the others would gently test it. Questions came before conclusions. No one rushed to win the argument. The purpose was shared reasoning, to explore uncertainty together without consequence and without performance. Mistakes were noted, not punished. Wrong hands were folded quietly, then forgotten. This is where All In truly formed, not as a podcast, not as a brand, but as a habit, a way of thinking collectively, calmly, and without spectacle. When the physical table later disappeared, the habit remained. Practiced, familiar, ready to move elsewhere. When the world closed its doors in early 2020, the rhythm they had practiced for years was suddenly interrupted. Flights were canceled, offices emptied. The poker table went quiet. What surprised them most was not the disruption itself, but how much they missed the steady cadence of thinking together. To fill the gap, they began calling one another more often. At first it was casual, a quick check-in, a forwarded article, a chart sent without commentary. Soon, the conversations grew longer. A group chat filled with links about epidemiology, economic shutdowns, stimulus packages, and supply chains under stress. They shared information not to sound informed, but to reduce uncertainty. Video calls replaced chairs. Kitchens and spare bedrooms became meeting rooms. Children wandered into frame. Dogs slept at their feet. The setting was informal, but the discussions were focused. They spoke about startup liquidity and runway, about whether capital markets would freeze, about what happened when small businesses lost weeks, then months of revenue. The conversation slowed naturally. There was no rush to conclusions. Each voice brought something different to the call. One framed the macro picture, another questioned policy incentives, another returned to data and probabilities, another pressed for practical consequences. Together, they recreated the same habit the poker table had taught them. At some point, someone suggested recording a conversation, not for an audience, not for promotion, just to capture the thinking. On March 19th, they pressed record. What they didn't yet realize was that the habit they had built in private was about to become a ritual for many others. As the first episode circulated, something unexpected happened. Listeners responded not to certainty, but to the lack of it. The pauses were left intact. Questions remained open. Disagreement was allowed to settle rather than escalate. In a media environment built for speed, this slowness stood out. Episodes followed a familiar arc. They opened with reflection, moved gently into analysis, and returned often to first principles. Markets were discussed as systems, not scoreboards. Policy was examined through incentives rather than ideology. Technology was treated as infrastructure, shaping behavior, Long after headlines faded, the audience grew steadily. Founders listened while walking late at night. Investors played episodes on long drives. Policymakers tuned in quietly, curious how operators were interpreting events. The podcast climbed charts without advertising or urgency, carried forward by trust and repetition. Behind the scenes, very little changed. Audio improved, scheduling became more predictable, but the structure remained loose. They spoke to each other, not at an audience. That choice preserved intimacy, even as reach expanded. Over time, roles clarified without being assigned. One voice traced long arcs through history and markets. Another pressed for operational clarity. Another slowed the conversation with legal and institutional grounding. Another returned again and again to data and science. The balance felt natural because it had been rehearsed for years. What listeners heard was not performance chemistry, but familiarity. A group of people thinking aloud, carefully, without haste. In an anxious moment, that tone became its own form of reassurance. Growth brought tension, but it also revealed the strength of the foundation beneath the show. The hosts did not always agree, and they made no effort to hide it. Political differences surfaced. Views on regulation diverged. Debates sharpened as global events raised the stakes. Yet the arguments followed a familiar pattern. One person spoke, another listened. Claims were examined, not attacked. When voices rose, they settled again without intervention. No moderator stepped in. The relationship mattered more than being right, and that priority was audible. Off the microphone, the conversations continued. Clarifications were offered. Apologies were made when lines were crossed. The show did not fracture under disagreement because it was never built on alignment alone. It was built on trust. For listeners, this dynamic offered something rare. Disagreement without hostility. Debate without spectacle. Many found comfort in that steadiness, especially as public discourse elsewhere grew brittle and loud. As the podcast matured, the hosts resisted the pull to formalize. No rigid format emerged. No strict timing rules were imposed. Episodes expanded or contracted as topics required. The conversational shape remained intact. That restraint preserved the original spirit of All In. Four people thinking together out loud without rushing to resolution. In a world increasingly defined by speed, that slowness became its quiet strength. By the time the world began to reopen, All In had become more than a pandemic artifact. It was a fixture, a weekly rhythm for people who preferred understanding over reaction. The audience had grown, but the center held. Live conversations followed, bringing familiar voices into shared physical spaces. Panels replaced poker tables, but the cadence remained the same. Questions were explored patiently. Ideas were allowed to breathe. The ritual had simply widened. Still, the essence of the show did not change. Four distinct paths, shaped by different geographies and disciplines, continued to converge in conversation. Their shared history of building companies, navigating risk, and sitting with uncertainty infused every exchange. All In was not built to entertain, though it often did. It was not designed to persuade, though it sometimes influenced. Its purpose remained simple: to think clearly, together, in public. As the night settles and the mind loosens its grip, it is enough to know that some conversations are meant to be slow, that understanding arrives gently, and that even in uncertain times, a steady voice, returning week after week, can help the world feel briefly more navigable. As the weeks passed, the rhythm of the podcast began to settle into something familiar. Episodes arrived regularly, not announced with fanfare, but simply appearing like a light left on in the evening. Listeners came to expect the cadence, a slow opening, a thoughtful unfolding, a conversation that did not rush them toward conclusions. The hosts noticed something subtle. Their own thinking improved through repetition. Speaking ideas aloud, returning to them weeks later, revisiting assumptions, all of it sharpened clarity. The podcast became not just a broadcast, but a feedback loop. Thoughts matured over time. They began to reference past episodes, not as authority, but as memory. A question raised months earlier would resurface, examined again in light of new data. This continuity created a sense of journey rather than commentary. Events were not isolated. They were chapters. For many listeners, this became a form of mental anchoring. The world outside felt chaotic, but here the same voices returned week after week, willing to think slowly. That consistency mattered more than certainty. Without ever intending to, All In had become a ritual. As the audience grew, so did the range of topics. What began as pandemic analysis expanded outward, touching nearly every corner of modern life. Markets and interest rates remained central, but they were joined by conversations about energy systems, climate risk, artificial intelligence, and global supply chains. The hosts approached each subject the same way. They resisted novelty for novelty's sake. New technologies were not treated as miracles or threats, but as tools shaped by incentives and human behavior. History was often invoked not to predict, but to provide context. Friedberg would slow the conversation with scientific grounding, explaining how systems behave over time. Sachs would trace legal and institutional frameworks, asking how rules evolve under pressure. Jason would pull discussions back to founders and operators, focusing on execution. Chamath would zoom out, connecting decisions to societal outcomes. This balance allowed complex ideas to remain accessible. No one voice dominated for long. The conversation moved in waves, each perspective rising and receding. Listeners learned not just what the hosts thought, but how they thought. And for many, that was the quiet education. Eventually, the phrase, "the besties," emerged, half joke, half acknowledgement. The hosts used it casually at first, laughing at themselves for the label. But it stuck because it described something real. This was not a transactional partnership. It was a relationship built over years of shared risk, shared meals, and shared silence. The audience sensed that. They could hear when a comment came from familiarity rather than performance. Inside jokes accumulated, nicknames appeared and disappeared. Mistakes were remembered lightly, then released. The tone remained warm, even when topics grew heavy. The hosts leaned into the humor not to deflect seriousness, but to keep perspective. Laughter softened edges. It reminded everyone that behind the analysis were people still learning. For listeners, the term besties became an invitation not to agree with everything, but to sit in the conversation without tension, to listen without bracing. With time, the conversations moved beyond the screen. Live events began to take shape, offering listeners a chance to gather in person. Rooms replaced comment sections. Applause replaced silence. Yet, even on stage, the pace remained deliberate. Panels unfolded without scripts. Questions were explored rather than answered quickly. The energy was thoughtful, not theatrical. The poker table had grown larger, but its spirit was intact. Titles mattered less than curiosity. Disagreement was welcomed, not managed away. People listened. For the hosts, these gatherings reinforced something they had felt from the beginning. There was a hunger for spaces where thinking could happen slowly in public without collapsing into noise. All In was no longer just a podcast, it was a place. With time, the conversations moved beyond the screen. Live events began to take shape, offering listeners a chance to gather in person. Rooms replaced comment sections. Applause replaced silence. Yet, even on stage, the pace remained deliberate. Panels unfolded without scripts. Questions were explored rather than answered quickly. The energy was thoughtful, not theatrical. The poker table had grown larger, but its spirit was intact. Titles mattered less than curiosity. Disagreement was welcomed, not managed away. People listened. For the hosts, these gatherings reinforced something they had felt from the beginning. There was a hunger for spaces where thinking could happen slowly in public without collapsing into noise. As the months passed, All In stopped feeling like a response to crisis and began to feel like a fixture. Episodes arrived with a quiet regularity, not announced loudly, not framed as breaking news, but simply appearing. Listeners came to expect them, the way one expects the return of evening light or the hum of a familiar street. The audience grew gradually. Founders listened while pacing empty offices. Investors played episodes during long drives, letting the conversation fill the car. Policymakers and journalists tuned in quietly, curious how operators and builders were interpreting the same events they were covering. There was no single demographic, only a shared appetite for slower thinking. What surprised the hosts most was not the size of the audience, but its patience. Listeners did not demand certainty. They tolerated open questions. They returned even when conclusions shifted. This allowed the show to remain what it had always been, a conversation rather than a performance. In time, All In became a rhythm in people's weeks, not something to chase, but something to return to. And that return, repeated over months, gave the podcast its quiet strength. As the scope of topics expanded, the conversations followed the same measured approach. Markets remained central, but they were joined by discussions of energy systems, artificial intelligence, climate risk, geopolitics, and long-term technological change. No subject was treated as isolated. Everything was connected back to incentives, behavior, and time. The hosts resisted urgency. New technologies were not framed as salvation or catastrophe, but as tools shaped by human decision-making. History was often invoked, not to predict outcomes, but to remind listeners that many moments once felt unprecedented. Friedberg would often slow the discussion with scientific grounding, explaining how systems behave under stress. Sachs traced institutional and legal frameworks, asking how rules evolve. Jason pressed for practical implications, especially for founders. Chamath zoomed out, connecting decisions to broader social consequences. For listeners, this balance offered a quiet education, not a lesson to memorize, but a way of seeing. Over time, people learned not just what the hosts thought, but how they thought, patiently, recursively, without haste. With growth came disagreement, and the show did not shy away from it. Political differences became more visible. Views on regulation, public policy, and social responsibility diverged. At times, debates grew sharper, reflecting the heightened stakes of the world beyond the podcast. Yet, even in disagreement, a shared discipline held. Arguments were allowed to unfold fully. Interruptions were rare. Claims were examined rather than dismissed. When voices rose, they settled again without intervention. Behind the scenes, the friendship endured. Conversations continued off-air. Clarifications were offered. Apologies were made when needed. The relationship was valued more than the momentary win. For listeners, this was instructive. Disagreement did not require hostility. Differences did not demand rupture. The show modeled a way of thinking together that many had forgotten was possible. In a fractured public discourse, that steadiness became one of All In's defining qualities. As the audience grew more engaged, the idea of gathering in person began to take shape. The first All In Summit brought voices that had lived on screens into shared physical space. Panels replaced poker tables, but the cadence remained familiar. There were discussions on artificial intelligence, monetary policy, climate technology, and global trade. Yet the defining feature was not the topics, but the pace. Speakers were allowed to finish thoughts. Questions were explored rather than rushed. The summits reinforced something the hosts had sensed from the beginning. There was a hunger for spaces where thinking could happen slowly without spectacle, where curiosity mattered more than certainty. For many attendees, the experience felt less like a conference and more like an extended conversation. The poker table had simply grown larger, its spirit intact. Beyond the stage and the microphone, the hosts continued to collaborate quietly. Investments crossed paths. Advice was shared privately. Support was offered without attribution. The podcast remained only one expression of a longer relationship. Philanthropic efforts emerged naturally, often in response to crisis. Funds were raised. Support was coordinated. These actions were rarely emphasized on air, mentioned briefly, if at all. What mattered more was continuity, the sense that this was not a project assembled for attention, but a relationship unfolding in public. Listeners could hear that difference. They could sense when a comment came from familiarity rather than performance. That authenticity, difficult to manufacture, sustained the show through cycles of attention and critique alike. Over time, the phrase "the besties" settled into place. It began as humor, a self-aware nod to the closeness of the group, but it resonated because it described something real. This was not a transactional partnership. It was a long-standing friendship shaped by shared risk and shared silence. Inside jokes accumulated. Nicknames appeared and faded. Mistakes were remembered lightly, then released. The tone remained warm, even when topics grew heavy. For listeners, the term became an invitation, not to agree with everything, but to listen without bracing, to sit inside a conversation that did not demand allegiance. In a media environment built on urgency, that warmth felt almost subversive. By the time the world had fully reopened, All In was no longer associated with a single moment. It had outlived the crisis that gave it visibility. It had become a habit. The audience had grown, but the center held. The cadence remained familiar, the voices unchanged. Week after week, the conversation returned. All In was not built to entertain, though it often did. It was not designed to persuade, though it sometimes influenced. Its purpose remained simple: to think clearly together, in public. That simplicity, sustained over time, gave it weight. Seen from a distance, the story of All In is a story of convergence. 4 separate lives, shaped by different countries, disciplines, and experiences, learned how to think together, first privately, then publicly. They did not manufacture chemistry. They carried it forward from years of shared reasoning, shared uncertainty, and shared patience. The microphones simply made it audible. The world around them continued to change. Markets rose and fell. Technologies reshaped daily life. Political climates shifted, yet the habit endured. Thinking slowly, listening carefully, speaking with restraint. As the night deepens, it becomes easier to see what the show offers beneath its surface. Not answers, but posture. Not certainty, but composure. A reminder that understanding takes time, and that haste rarely produces clarity. The voices soften as the day releases its grip. Questions remain unanswered, and that is acceptable. Tomorrow will bring new data, new perspectives, and new revisions. For now, the conversation can rest. Somewhere, 4 friends continue to talk, as they always have. Cards may shuffle. Screens may glow. Ideas may drift and return. You do not need to stay awake for any of it. Let the rhythm slow. Let the thoughts loosen their grip. Let the night take over. Good night.